Greetings. It's Sunday, January 12th, 2025. Welcome to the Dr. J blog series. On Sundays, we deal with the issues surrounding the purpose and meaning of life. Today's specific topic is the following: 5 faith traditions and their core principles for treating others. And there you see briefly a selfie of my wife and I on our last anniversary. We'll see the relevance of that in just a moment. I'm not a religious scholar or expert. I'm just a person who happens to have been raised as a Catholic, and when I was younger, attended Sunday school or catechism, or as we refer to it, CCD, which refers to the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine. Fun fact, I even spent several months as a 19-year-old studying with Father Gould at Holy Spirit Church, where we discussed the prospects of my entering the priesthood. But of course, I didn't persevere. Think of that. I could have been the Pope right now. Of course, that's like me saying, yeah, if I just worked harder and practiced harder, I could have ended up in the NBA. Not. Anyway, I'm married to the woman you saw on the previous screen, Farnaz. She's a Muslim woman, which means that we have an interfaith marriage. But to be fair to all the major faith traditions, since we have 5 boys in our blended family, we decided to raise each of them slightly differently. So one we raised as a Christian, one we raised as a Muslim, one we raised as a Jew, one as a Buddhist, and one in Hindu, just to be fair. No, seriously. But it's interesting if you look at the global populations of faiths, the distributions of people who subscribe to the different faith traditions. Christianity on a global, at least on the basis of our best guesses, that is global surveys and census reports across countries and so on, our best estimates at present are that just about 30% of the population, of the global population, identifies with Christianity, about 24% with Islam. Then you've got about 15% who subscribe to Hinduism, slightly less than 7% who acknowledge Buddhism as their primary faith. And then you've got 5 to 6% who practice various folk religions that are rooted in kind of more localized cultural practices and traditions. And you've got about between 15 and 16 million Jewish people as well, over 80% of whom, by the way, are split between or live in the United States or Israel. And I should mention, too, that just over 15% of the global population identifies or has been reportedly, they identify themselves as irreligious in nature. That is to say that there's an absence or even a rejection of religious beliefs. And this includes, the full range of agnostics and atheists who are out there. So those who are experts in the study of the sacred text obviously have much greater depth and breadth of knowledge on these subjects than I do. And what I've done over the years is essentially read selected snippets, kind of piecemeal, of the different sacred text, depending on the context, what I was doing, or what I was studying at the time. And so I certainly don't have a comprehensive understanding of any particular faith tradition. Even in Christianity, I've never read the Bible in whole or start to finish, certainly. More often, what I've done, and perhaps you've done this as well, is I've read specific texts, specific books, fiction and nonfiction alike, to get a better understanding of their traditions and an understanding of the broader themes and underlying principles of their practices, if you will. So, for today's talk, I'm discussing basically my brief takeaways about the 5 faith traditions with which I'm most familiar. And I want to talk about them in a couple of regards. One, about the purpose and meaning of life from the perspectives, as well as their core principles for how we should treat others. And what you see on the screen there then is my sort of very brief survey or breakdown, summary of what I believe to be the purpose and meaning of life from a Christian, a Jewish, a Muslim, Buddhist, and a Hindu perspective. So And again, this is certainly imperfect. It's very difficult to come up with a universally agreed upon shorthand description in this regard. So, as best I can determine from my readings and my limited knowledge, here's what I see as the main purpose and meaning of life from these five different faith traditions. Feel free to leave a comment if you have another, you'd like to alter the wording slightly, or perhaps you have a different understanding based on different criteria. So, from Christianity, it's to love and serve God. The meaning of love, the meaning of life is love from God through us. So, that's what I took to be the core teachings. In Judaism, it's to embody the Torah by living an ethical life, sacrifice for, and reach out to others in love. From Islam, to know, love, and serve Allah and strengthen our connection through our daily service to humanity. From Buddhism, to achieve enlightenment and nirvana, thereby ending the cycle of birth and death, as well as suffering. And from Hinduism, to seek and realize divinity within ourselves by following the universal laws of nature. Again, I'm not meaning to be controversial. I'm just trying to come up with a succinct way of describing the purpose and meaning of life from these different traditions. In terms of the core principles for treating others, there's an almost infinite variety of teachings and anecdotes, proverbs, and verses that you could choose. In some cases, or specific verses, the teachings are decidedly judgmental and negative, at least towards certain peoples or under certain circumstances. So, what I've merely tried to do here is to identify what I understand to be the big three principles that inform, ideally, how we should treat others if you're a follower of this particular faith tradition. And you'll see a considerable overlap then in terms of the actual words that are emphasized. Okay. And so from Christianity, we see kindness, forgiveness, and compassion. Christian example from the Bible, Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you. End quote. So Ephesians advises people to, quote, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. So again, there's countless verses you could point to and so forth. So I'm just trying to give a few examples. A Jewish example from the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the book of Leviticus 19:2, teaches that God instructed Moses to tell the Israelites to be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. End quote. Numerous instructions follow that are now known as the Holiness Code. Much of it's focused on extending dignity, justice, and compassion to others, including strangers. And Jewish scholars stress that the classic discussion, I should say, of human dignity appears in the Babylonian Talmud that highlights, quote, the value of human dignity above all else. So, and then if we look at Islam, the Quran states in verse 1770 that people should treat one another with honor, respect, and loving kindness because everyone's created by God and therefore has dignity. And one can certainly look to the five pillars of Islam for a broader overview of what's expected of the followers. These include the declaration of faith, shahada, prayer, salah, almsgiving, zakat, fasting, psalm, I should say, and pilgrimage or hajj. Buddhism, too, has the sacred text, their own sacred text, the Tripitaka, and these comprise the teachings of Buddha, known collectively as Dharma. One of the most widely known sacred scriptures, the Dhammapada, comes from the Pali Tripitaka. Therein, we are instructed to avoid all evil, to cultivate good, and cleanse one's mind. And then more specific directives are given later on, specifically to avoid irritability in deed, word, and thought, and to exercise self control. And finally, one should abide by the five precepts of the fundamental moral code of Buddhism. That is, disciples should treat all things with kindness and compassion, live honestly and righteously, control sensual desires, speak the truth, and live a sober, upright life. And do all of this while you're fulfilling your duties to your family, to the people in your immediate sphere of influence, to the recluses and the Brahmins who depend upon the laity for their survival and maintenance. So there are, of course, and then there's Hinduism. Many sacred texts that are associated there include for example, the Vedas, the sacred Veda text, the Upanishads, and the Itihasa. So, for example, in Upanishads, there are several lovely passages, such as the following: He who sees all beings in the self itself, and the self in all beings, feels no hatred by virtue of that wisdom. So it's that concept of the oneness of all being. Um, the theme appears repeatedly that Hindus should ensure that they don't inflict pain and suffering upon others while striving to live their lives in compassionate and caring ways. So there's really not a negative thought in any of these, right? So to be clear, I understand that the shared texts are massive and they're filled with all kinds of information and scriptures and parables, prescriptions and proscriptions, and so on. And if you're a believer or just interested in studying one of these faith traditions in greater, detail, clearly you'll have to do a much deeper dive and invest considerable energy to get there. Um, you can discuss and debate with others the meanings of the sacred texts, as well as possible areas where you might disagree with what's being expressed, or where you feel like there's some sort of troublesome passages or maybe even contradictions that need to be resolved. So, for myself, I just try to focus on the good in others, first and foremost, and I look for the good in religion and the sacred texts as well. So, I try to focus on the positives and what I believe to be their core spiritual teachings and the meanings attached to those teachings, as well as the kind of fundamental principles for how we should treat one another. And so that starts with some basic reading and often listening to others talk about their faiths. This is why we attend services or attend meetings of various kinds, because we want to hear people's perspectives and hopefully people that are a little bit more trained, experienced, and knowledgeable in those particular areas. So, for example, even my wife will sometimes share with me some of her ancient wisdom or what she's learned from her lifetime as a Muslim, right? Just as I'll share with her occasionally some ideas that I've learned in my life lived as a Christian or a Catholic. And perhaps not surprisingly, in almost all cases, we learn that our spiritual meanings overlap considerably. And then we support each other's religious traditions as well to a certain extent, such as celebrating Christmas together or with our family and celebrating Ramadan or fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, which we also do together. I just started to do that, to be honest, a couple of years ago. So that's just another way to sort of support one another's faith traditions. But the real challenge, in my view, is always the how do we self-consciously and intentionally put the principles into practice, belief into action. How do we translate our understanding of the purpose and meaning of life into our everyday practices that reflect the core principles that we abide by, or at least that we're supposed to abide by? And that's the real challenge in my view, because of course we're all too human and fallible. Simply put, because we're all confronted with a range of life's stressors, work related or health issues, sometimes, family problems, whatever the case may be, even catastrophic environmental conditions, right? These are unpredictable. Think of the LA fires, for example. But perhaps most challenging of all, we encounter people from time to time that might convey a certain toxicity, if you will, or those who might be inspired by hate in their hearts, or people who just want to hurt us, or just don't really care. They're indifferent towards us and our well being, and so on. So there's all kinds of people out there at different places in their journeys, and at the moment, dealing with whatever issues that they're dealing with as well. Um, so obviously, one of our challenges is how do we live a life based or rooted in these core principles and how we should act towards one another. And the challenge is to implement effective strategies to deal with circumstances, and especially those people who might be somewhat toxic or hateful in their orientations. And so, how do we deal with that? Or how do we deal with individuals? How do we deal with specific situations or encounters in a more constructive and spiritually enlightened way, regardless of our particular beliefs or faith traditions? Okay, so that's it for now. In the meantime, may you and yours, as always, create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And I hope to see you tomorrow. Take care.